Hey, welcome to my fourth attempt at a commentary video where I take something that I've seen myself or heard of, been pointed out to me, and chop it up into nuggets and talk about what it's saying to me and maybe to the broader church is mostly what these seem to be about. It's interesting that I'm seeing for myself a theme in the ones that I'm drawn to. And maybe that'll become apparent in this commentary video as well. So every now and then, some fellow pastors and I compare notes on podcasts that we appreciate or that we don't appreciate. One that comes up frequently as having engaging content is called UnBelievable with a question mark, and the "un" is written slightly different. So it's raising the question, is this believable or not, is my visual interpretation of that title and a little bit of experience with the podcast. A breakoff from that podcast is a presentation called The Big Conversation. My impression, so not my researched knowledge, is that this big conversation is geared to those who have a curiosity or animosity toward Christianity. This particular one annoyed me a little in the sense that the host seemed a little too eager to press for some kind of conversion narrative or moment with one of the guests. Maybe you'll see that yourself, maybe you won't. I will put a link to the source video in the notes so that you can look at the whole thing if you want. I've pulled about 22 minutes of clips out of a 74-minute or more conversation. These are what I think are the core nuggets. But it's geared to those who have curiosity or animosity towards Christianity. Maybe even geared to those who have devolved or deconstructed from organized Christianity. So this commentary, this video is my first deep dive into UnBelievable. The episode I'm talking about is one where the host has as guests N.T. Wright, whose name is more known in my circles than the other guy. The other guy is Douglas Murray. I know nothing about him except what is said in this conversation and some things that are implied, but he admits to being one who has dropped out of institutional Christianity. He says some very interesting and challenging things that make this whole video worth commenting on. I'm going to start off my clips with Douglas responding to an opening question about his experience of the pandemic, and I'm going to then just let the clips keep rolling, so roll right over into the second clip where the host very early on states the question they're considering in this particular episode.
Like everyone, it's a bleak time in lots of ways, and has things that are salvageable in it. I've had far more time to read than I normally do. I've very much enjoyed that. I've had the opportunity to do a lot of thinking, a lot of writing. I said at the beginning of the pandemic that in a way, those of us who are writers are rather well set up for it. To be a writer is to be able to deal with solitude, and that indeed you must have solitude. So we're rather practiced at it, but nevertheless, nothing can prepare you for something as strange as the era we've been through. And I suppose, maybe not leap straight in, but I do think that certainly my readings back over history and plagues in history seem to bear out one of the things I feel at the moment, which is that they have a disorientating effect on the civilizations across which they roam. All sorts of strange things come out of the woodwork, strange beliefs, strange fears, things you didn't know were there. And I think that's very much the case in our society and across the world in the last year, as much as it has been in history.
It does present an interesting context within which to be having today's conversation. We're asking, can we find a story to live by in a post-Christian world? And I wonder if we could start with your own story, Douglas. For those who perhaps haven't come across you before or don't know this particular aspect of your life. You did make claim to a faith yourself at one time. So tell us a little bit about that and what happened along the way.
Well, yes, I'm like most people from Britain. I'm not that comfortable about speaking about myself. I know we live in an era where everyone volunteers up their personal story first. I tend to always want to do it last, if at all. Yes, I mean it's not a secret, that having been said. I was born and brought up a Christian, a believing Christian from I think most of my life, including through my adult life, and I'm now in I suppose a self-confessedly conflicted, complex situation of being, among other things, an uncomfortable agnostic who recognizes the values and the virtues that the Christian faith has brought. I think I sort of laid out how I think our civilization, our culture has got to the stage that it is at the moment, and its current uncomfortable relationship with faith. I tried to lay that out in The Strange Death of Europe. I still believe what I wrote there was accurate as a diagnosis of the era. But it's a very uncomfortable, as I say, position that someone like me is in, because I say, there has been a period of rejection of faith, particularly from what in our lifetimes has been known as the New Atheist movement, which made claims that were self-confessedly wrong. That, for instance, actually I think as a late friend of both Tom Wright's and mine, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs once said, that the claim that, for instance, morality was obvious was obviously wrong. The claim that basic ethics that we might share are self-evident is self-evidently not the case. One doesn't have to be an ethicist to know that. You just need to travel. You just need to read, look and listen, and to know that's the case.
So what they're trying to get at in this program is addressing the question, can we find a story to live by in a post-Christian world? It's a great question to be considering, because the rules, even of how Christianity is to be presented in our society, have changed and shifted under us as the church. And it's important to consider this. What are the rules now? The rules of presentation, what works? And so then he asks Douglas Murray to tell his story, and Douglas Murray is clearly uncomfortable with that whole question, but he does talk about a period or a time in his life where he rejected the faith. But he also is not aligned, it sounds like he was at one point, with the New Atheist movement, and he sees them as clearly wrong as well. And over the course of the whole conversation, he's not aligned with some of the new movements, what we would refer to in shorthand as being woke, either. So he must be a fairly conservative commentator when he writes for his paper in England. So, but this piece ends with the pointing to the belief of the benefit, of being exposed to other thinking and other cultures. And that's where I want to comment a bit, because I have a saying that I use with pride. I say I made it up myself, and the saying is preaching to the choir in the locker room. This saying that I use deliberately mixes a couple of metaphors to illuminate the reality that we tend to jabber with those who agree with us, and when in their company, privately, will say more vicious things about our opponents or perceived opponents than when we are in public. And that's preaching to the choir in the locker room. It's all associated also with language I use for the fact that, like in particular denominations, but in general, we tend to live within bubbles of agreement. We don't easily associate with people outside of our own bubble of beliefs. And I think Douglas Murray is very correct in saying the way to break that bubble, The way to break out of preaching to the choir in the locker room is to deliberately and openly engage with the other for the sake of learning, I would add, not to correct them. So he gives two very good correctives to that narrowness: reading and traveling. Experiencing different cultures and worldviews by entering them physically or in the imagination. Note, he emphasizes the need to do so while looking and listening, like as an observer, as an inquirer. I would add to that, traveling to Thailand and insisting on being served a cheeseburger in a restaurant, in a local restaurant, is not what he's talking about. That's not the kind of travel he's talking about. It's interesting that the theme of the conversation is finding a story to live by. This intrigued me, and the title itself, but then also that Douglas Murray is reluctant to tell his story. And he takes even a gentle, polite British jab, academic jab, at those who tend to lead with their own story. That's part of my story, is to learn the value of story and how my story shapes what I believe. And so that was a little tweak moment for me there. We'll move to the next clip now.
Has, in my view, I think we spoke about this before, Justin, that there has, in my view, been an interesting movement in recent years, which I think Tom Holland, who you mentioned earlier, is certainly an example of, people saying, actually, if we go back and look at this, what we have and what we like does have roots in this, in the Christian story. Now, the follow-on question from there, I suppose, is, well, what do we do about it? And I think that a great failing of our time has been the tendency to talk past each other on this. The religious tend to say, well, it's easy, you just have to believe. If you recognize these virtues and values, then believe, and doesn't take into account the fact that very many people today, it is harder than that, for all sorts of reasons we could go into. But I would just make one other observation, which is that even outside of faith, I have an added discomfort, which is the discomfort of a non-believer who is disappointed by the behavior of the believing church. Now, many people think that that's paradoxical, but it isn't at all. I not only was brought up in, but afterwards sought the church as it has been in England, and its jewels and gems of the King James Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and much more. And it's been my experience, as it has been for many other people brought up in recent decades and last century and more, that one has observed the church giving up its jewels and becoming something else. And actually, that irritation I feel from the outside, albeit from the outside at the moment, that irritation I feel about the church hasn't gone away even whilst being outside it. A fear, it comes back to that article that provoked Tom Wright's excellent letter. My fear is constantly the church is not doing what so many of us on the outside would like it to do, which is to be preaching its gospel, to be asserting its truths and its claims. And so when one sees it falling into all of the latest tropes, one just thinks, well, that's another thing gone. It's just like absolutely everything else in the era. Everything in this boring, monotone, ill thought out and shallow dialectic. And so as I say, I'm a disappointed non-adherent.
This for me is like the top nugget clip. There are two very significant ones in this set of clips that I have. But this idea of a disappointed non-adherent. He's a non-believer who is disappointed by the behavior of the believing church. So here is an outsider, we would call him, who's telling us as the church that we should be doing better at something. A part that I didn't quite relate to is this nostalgia for the King James Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. I left out a piece where N.T. Wright responds with some sympathy, empathy to that. whole idea. They both seem to have a great admiration for what I would call high culture religious expression, such as found in the King James Version and the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. So they appreciate this in the same way that they would appreciate Shakespeare as representative of a way of speaking, a way of communicating, and a particular use of the language. But here's what I highlighted in my notes on this. Church is not doing what so many of us on the outside would like it to do, which is, he goes on to give that answer, and this is a quote, to be preaching its gospel, asserting its truth and its claims, but instead, Douglas Murray sees it falling into all of the latest tropes, and he ends up in a place of, oh, well, there's another thing gone, another core thing of our culture evaporating. That's the way he says it. I'm interpreting it a little bit, like so much in the era. So he laments that something is lost, and we'll get to that. And then he kind of mocks everything is presented in this boring monotone. It's ill thought out, and it's a shallow dialectic. Wow. And that's then it ends with him calling himself a disappointed non-adherent. So I find intriguing this comparison, because N.T. Wright does the same thing, in fact builds on it, where this comparing understanding Christianity to understanding art or high culture. I think that's a very, very dangerous, almost snobbish agreement that they have there. But that I may be mishearing things, but that's what I heard, how I heard it presented. So N.T. Wright, in his response, the piece that I left out, points to regular Christians who are doing Christianity and nobody pays attention, but he thinks of it as an invisible correctness, where the church at work, is what he refers to this as, shows the theory and theology in action, and that makes it all good for him. He implies he shouldn't have just the theory and theology, but without the action. But as we'll learn, the lament is that, by Douglas Murray anyway, that it seems that the church seems to be all about the action and the social justice action now, more so than their core purpose.
But there's a great deal to be encouraged by, as well as, and as Douglas knows, I share his frustration when it appears that the church is simply jumping on the latest trendy bandwagon. I mean, one quick example, and then I'll shut up. About 10 years ago, when the debate on women bishops was really getting going, David Cameron in the House of Commons said rather disdainfully about the Church of England, yes, it's time they got on with it. They should get with the programme. And I wrote a cross article for the Times to say, no, we are, I hope, going to have women bishops, not because it's the programme that our society is moving in some sort of spurious, progressive idea.
That was just a bit of N.T. Wright's response that I included to set up the next piece. I, again, skipped a whole lot. I think N.T. Wright missed the point a little bit in some of his earlier response to this, and so here, this piece sets up what he says next.
It's actually about a vision of the whole of life. And if that's why I worry about this word religion and religious, because it didn't mean in the first century what it means now either. So I would rather talk about God the creator and God the reconciler and redeemer of creation, focused of course on Jesus, but with then the followers of Jesus commissioned to do those things which say to the world, there is a different way to be human, and following Jesus is the key to it.
But
Yes,
if I may say, you're slightly unusual, or becoming slightly unusual in this regard, in that you're a theologian, a bishop, and a very prominent face in the faith, who does say these things, and this seems to me to be uncommon at the moment. And what one hears from prominent bishops, archbishops even, is an attempt to slip into the rhetoric of the era, and indeed slip into the ethics and the ethical claims of the era, without making those foundational assertions that, as I say, I think that many people are hungry for.
So N.T. Wright is on track here now. Now he's finally getting to the nub of what they're talking about. They've done the King James and all that kind of stuff. And he says the focus needs to be on Jesus. And if it's not rooted there, there's a problem. And it just struck me that Douglas Murray then says that's uncommon to hear that. That surprised me even a little bit. And they must have certain church leaders in mind when they're talking that I don't know about. So he says that's uncommon to hear someone just say that publicly. And he laments how church leaders seem to slip into the rhetoric of the era and the ethics and ethical claims of today without focusing on bringing what many people are hungry for. And so Wright is starting to address exactly that. For someone in Douglas Murray's position to be admitting this is what people are hungry for is just extremely intriguing to me, and something that we do well to pay attention to. I've had a number of conversations in the last few years with people who indicate what they're hoping for out of this world, or out of like what they're finding in Jordan Peterson that they don't find elsewhere. Things like that we just got to pay attention to this. Here's the next one.
There is bound to be a confusing convergence between a genuine Jesus-following desire to see, for instance, social justice. It's written right across the New Testament that there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, no male and female, that God made all humans of a single stock, and so on. This is basic, and how that got forgotten in the last few hundred years is a shameful story in the Western Church. So that I think the church needs to reclaim what was always part of its heritage, a view of the renewal of the whole human race and a new sort of family in which identity, that's one of our straplines for tonight,
We've had a little pause on Tom's video there, hoping it'll come back in just a moment's time. We are live on our live stream tonight. But the point being that Tom was making there, Douglas, that we are looking, the Bible has always had, and Christianity specifically, this idea of an identity. Sorry, I think Tom's back. So Tom, do you want to finish your point? You just got interrupted by the internet for a moment.
Sorry, I wasn't sure where we broke off.
It was just, you were saying in the Bible, it's always been about the neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female,
yes.
slave nor free, one identity.
And about the point from Acts 17, where Paul says on the Areopagus, hey, God made all people from the same stuff, from the same stock. We belong together. And rather than, and of course, then we get into the trap, which Douglas has written about as well, of the modern idea that we're all identical, including there being no difference between male and female, etc., versus the postmodern idea, which collapses into dozens of different competing identities, each trying to claim the high ground of the victim, etc., etc. And again, I think Douglas and I are on the same page on this one. But then my point would be that the church, in being true to itself and not simply relying on contemporary, rather shallow ethical maxims, but being true to its original gospel, actually has the makings of doing what, at its best, some of the woke ideologies are seeking to do, which is a genuine passion for justice. Forget the fact that the Marxists have come in on the act. Of course they have, because if the church misses out half of its agenda, it shouldn't be surprised if other people come rushing in from the side to fill it in.
So this is what I hear in what's being said. And again, I like what N.T. Wright is saying. He's more on track here. But my understanding right now is that Christianity has created this foundation of beliefs and practices and understandings. And those were built on the Jesus event, as we say it, and the gospel message going out, creating cultures that had a lot of flaws, but also had some basics that were woven into them. Tom Holland is one of the ones that points this out in his latest book, Dominion. And so that has happened, and now what has started to happen in a dominant way is that some of these particular pieces of Christianity or Christian culture or Christian worldview have started to take on a life of their own, amputated from the root story, the root narrative. And so then this notion of all humans being equal, which Wright points out is in Scripture already long ago, becomes now this movement towards equalizing everyone, and that combines with the Bible story. The story of Jesus is really, in some ways, I have to simplify, a story of the victim becoming the hero, and has created a culture in which claiming to be a victim, and I mean that not as a spurious claim, but it could be a legit, being a victim is an empowering thing, possibly for the first time ever. I don't know enough about history, but possibly for the first time ever. And so that's a new thing in our culture as well, that the foundations of Christianity made possible, and now that is combining with this equality thing to create a whole other movement of, as people typify it, trying to out-victim each other. That's what N.T. Wright seems to refer to there. And the way to do that is the more identities that you can find for yourself that have some victim hashtag on them, the better you think you look to society. And those two things, very simply put, are a major movement in our culture. I'm watching, as I'm creating this, I'm watching a new video that just came out with Rex Murphy being talked to by Jordan Peterson, and man, it's a rather old worldview that they exchange, and Rex Murphy is just delightful to listen to in the language, the way he uses language. He's verbally intelligent like you wouldn't believe, and then also an intellectual on top of that. And they hint at some of this as well. So that's what they're talking about here, and it sounds like even Douglas Murray sees this danger and is calling the church back to that core message that needs to be spoken clearly into the society. It's just quite fascinating to me, and kind of alarming in a healthy way, in the kind of stress or alarm that motivates new thought, motivates new action. I'll move to the next one with Douglas Murray responding.
Go ahead, Douglas.
Yes, I think this is very important. It gets to another point I've written about a fair amount in recent years, which is, I think, you know, Justin, I think maybe when we spoke before, we spoke about this, that sometimes people claim that the sort of public ethics of the time are sort of non-existent. That's not quite true. They're trying to dig down in quite a forceful way at the moment. What I was writing about in that article was just one example of that. But as I think I said to you when we spoke before, what I think of as being the most striking failure of the time is the failure to embed any ethic that does not rely on the Christian ethic in regards to the equality of everyone in the eyes of God. Our age is struggling very badly with an attempt to replace that ethic or find another way to do it. And there are various ways which it's tried to do that. Human rights ideology is one way, fairly developed, but I think not successful. And another is effectively the landing on equity as the answer, when it can't be the answer. But I see what people are struggling to do, which is to try to maintain and hold on to this exceptionally important gift of the Christian inheritance. Without the idea of equality in the eyes of God and the value of every individual in the eyes of God, you are left with these attempts to assert that, for instance, everyone is the same,
Yes.
or can be, and it's clear that we can't be and that we aren't.
So I won't say too much here. If you listen to those back to back enough, what N.T. Wright last said and what Douglas Murray said, they're really saying the same thing in very different language, and they're kind of echoing each other. But again, it's significant that a disappointed non-adherent is aware and is saying that this foundational piece needs to be reconnected with these things, or we're in trouble. Let's go to the next one.
You look at the great error of the ideology which is trying to embed today. It is that it has spent no time bothering itself over the question of forgiveness. Now, it's not just that I think that the church is missing a PR trick in not addressing this. I think that the church does everybody in society the most enormous disservice if it doesn't say, this is what our faith is built upon. We have been thinking about this and trying to practice it, at least, for millennia. So at least give us your ear for a moment.
So he's already assented, Douglas has, to the Jesus event needing to be talked about, the gospel message. And then he points out one of the unique things among all religions that Christianity carries and is the carrier of, and that is the teaching on forgiveness. And again, it's just so striking that he points this out, and that he calls for this rerouting into Christianity of these ethics, as he calls them, and yet he's a disappointed non-adherent. It's like it I don't know, it feels significant to me in a way that I can't quite articulate yet.
That's really important. I was talking to a good friend just this morning on email who has been writing a short article about wokeness, and he wanted me to comment, and I said, the one thing you need to point out is that all the woke morality is simply about you guys are wrong and you guys are wrong and you're full of hate and you're this and you're that. And there is no sense that if you repent, we'll forgive you. No. You just have to grovel. And
for me, right there, N.T. Wright nails something that I've felt, but not been able to articulate. And I don't even know if I'd put it in that kind of language, but in this context, that's how it came out for him. But he does point out that there does not seem to be a whole lot of space for forgiveness in some of the movements that are strong today. And I felt that reading some of the books lately on racism, for instance, white fragility, that kind of thing, where I'm completely on the defensive in the reading, and I feel terrible about myself or the history that I represent as a white male, and yet there's no option offered in some of these books for forgiveness. And again, this is a whole other thing, but this call to grovel, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's value to getting on your knees, not necessarily in a groveling sense, but in asking forgiveness and working hard to not repeat the sins of the past, of racism and colonialism, the sinful parts of them, because they have good parts as well, but that too gets forgotten. And yeah, find something else. So for me, that when I first saw that, I thought, yeah, that describes this defensive feeling that I've been part of.
In a quote-unquote post-Christian world, we're not in a less religious world in the sense that these ideologies become quite religious, but not in a very grace-filled kind of religion. And you've spoken about that yourself, Douglas, that there's that kind of aspect to the way people then grasp certain identities and certain causes and ideologies, and that becomes their sort of their identity, their religion. And I suppose this is the problem, isn't it? We are meaning-seeking, story-driven creatures, and if it's not going to be the story of Christianity, it's going to be another story.
Yes.
And the question is, can we live together with these very different stories, which often bump up against each other?
Again, I want to stress that the problem with that is that you can't just do it by you and me saying, and anyone else who's listening, by the way, you should be going out and getting on with it, though we all should, and it is difficult, but yes. But it can only ultimately become instantiated in a community and in the settled habits of somebody's life when you have at the heart of the faith the story of Jesus going to the cross to defeat the powers of evil. Because without that, then forgiveness is a lovely idea for other people to practice, but too hard for me, as it were. But if Jesus has actually dealt with evil in his death, whatever that means, and you have to have lots of discussions about how that plays out, of course, then who am I to go on actually holding it against this person or that person? And that's why forgiveness then has as its positive side reconciliation. Forgiveness shouldn't just leave you with, as it were, a zero bank balance. It ought then to open the way for reconciliation.
So I let two clips run together there. Hopefully they flow okay. I'll admit that I'm kind of at a place where I feel like I've spent enough time on this. I have other videos I want to get started on, and so I'm maybe getting impatient towards the end here. But now N.T. Wright in that clip moves from the forgiveness to the reconciliation and to the community aspect of the gospel message lived out in a Christian community. And that's a beautiful step to take to kind of start to complete the gospel picture, because he's done Jesus going to the cross, he's done the kingdom, and then Douglas Murray brought in forgiveness, and now he takes it to reconciliation. And the ridiculousness of not seeking reconciliation if you carry the title of Christian. It's good stuff. I'm going to let the last piece go, and then I'll do some final comment.
And that seems to me to be, as I say, why it saddens me, to put it no stronger, that that a religion with this inheritance, with all of this to offer, would offer the most watered down version of itself, to the extent that it is a version that is indistinguishable from everything else on offer in society. One of them says to himself, to Steiner, who's obviously Jewish, but you don't understand, we don't have a book. And Steiner said it was one of the most flooring and distressing things he had ever heard. We don't have a book. Now, obviously, these people were not Christian. But what they noticed was they did not have a thing to draw upon in the same way that, for instance, Steiner, although he wasn't exactly a believing a Jew, I think, had the Torah. There's a similar point made by Alan Bloom in one of his books in the 1980s. I can't remember which one, where he says if you're not going to have the Bible, you would need to have a book of equivalent seriousness to base it all on. And I've always thought this is a very important challenge, because there are books that people might put forward to try to base it on, but they are never of equivalent seriousness. And it's actually quite hard to think of a book of equivalent seriousness to the Bible. But I do think this is a challenge. What would you base it all on?
Exactly. And it's fascinating because A.C. Grayling, maybe 10 years ago, produced that thing called The Good Book, which was his attempt to do a sort of secular Bible, and it fell flat on its face.
Yeah.
It was I thought it was a very shallow and rather distressing production. But the point of the Christian Bible is, yes, it's a book which does this, that, and the other. It's a great story, but the Christian Bible, the climax of the story is, of course, Jesus. The four Gospels bring the story of Israel to an unexpected and very shocking climax. as a result of which all sorts of other things happen. So it isn't that the Bible is just full of abstract teachings and ethics, etc. And, oh yeah, we've got this book which tells us what to do. It's a story, and you're invited to get on board with the story and to be part of the onward movement that takes it forward from there. I would say it's one of the strengths of postmodernity that it has highlighted the ineradicable nature of story within human life. So, there was a kind of a modernist rationalism which imagined you could reduce everything to propositions and that stories were just kid stuff to entertain the masses while the real philosophers got on with the hard-edged propositions. And I think we now all know, and this is one of the good things about postmodernity, that yes, we live on stories, but the fact that it is a story then does raise the question, but did it happen? It's the question which comes up in a court of law the whole time. It's no good standing there as a witness and saying, let me tell you a story, once upon a time, because the judge wants to know and the jury wants to know, but did it happen? And you can rank stories according to the apparent intention of the storyteller. Is this a story which was designed? I mean, take Jesus' parables. It makes no sense to say of the parable of the prodigal son, but what was the father's name? Or what did the mother say when they came back? Or which bit of the farm did he then own? That misses the point as a matter of genre. But if you take Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, actually, it would miss the point of those stories to say, oh, they were just spinning these fantasy narratives like sort of Pilgrim's Progress or something out of thin air. No, Luke is very particular about this. Let me give you the dates. It was in the reign of so-and-so, and so-and-so was the high priest, and this, that, and the other. This is stuff that happened. And the point is, the happenedness of it has changed the world. And I'm back to something Douglas said half an hour ago. We have sold ourselves short in Western Christianity because we don't know the true story of church history and all the great stuff that has happened, and we have believed the Enlightenment lie that Christianity was just part of the problem rather than part of the solution all along. That's a whole other topic, but so I want to say, yes, beware of story collapsing into myth. Know what the different kinds of stories are and how they work.
Made that discovery in the company of a great storyteller himself, J.R.R. Tolkien, of course.
Tolkien, yes. Yes.
And in that sense, there is this idea that these great myth stories, they are, Lord of the Rings is arguably drenched in a kind of Christological overtones, and that these are the stories that seem to compel us and grab us and so on. And in that sense, as time is drawing to a close, Douglas, I suppose, you've been so very gracious, because a lot of these have been very personal sort of questions about faith and that kind of thing. But do you wish for it to be true? Do you wish that there was, that, as Lewis said, this is the true myth? Is that something that you could see making sense of the world if there was a true story that everything sort of came?
Of course. I mean, I don't really understand people who don't wish it to be true. I don't really understand those people. I do have known some. We mentioned one earlier who don't wish it to be true, didn't wish it to be true. No, of course I do. I suppose that one thing that I've always found extremely powerful in that regard is whenever I've been in the Holy Land, Israel, surrounding area. I never forget one of the first times I was there. I think during the 2006 conflict in Lebanon, and I was speaking I happened to stop one day, and there was a church that was being built, and it's quite unusual to need a new church in that neck of the woods, but one was being built for various reasons. And I asked the person who was in charge that day, I said, by the way, what's the name of the church? And he said, it's the Church of the Transfiguration. And I said, beautiful. How did you decide to do that? And he said, well, here we name churches after the nearest site, and the Transfiguration happened there. And he pointed to the mountain beside us. And wherever in the world you're brought up as a Christian, it makes an enormous impact on when you see the physical sites. I've traveled around there a lot, and I don't think for me anything quite equals that in terms of making an impact on me.
Hey, I want to congratulate you for making it this far. I'm in a learning journey. This is my 4th attempt at commentary video. I'm learning the technology and all those things. What a significant thing. I thought this was a good place to end it, where Douglas Murray says, basically, I want it to be tangible. And that's a call to those of us who do follow the way of Jesus, is to help make it tangible, experienceable for the people that are non-adherents, not quite acquainted with what it all means yet. So I let a few clips run. Just again, I just want to get finished, and didn't feel like my interjections were going to be all that significant. There's something going on in my process of doing these videos. So in other words, as I think of the 4 that I've done so far, I can see a theme, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with that. But the theme basically seems to be church leaders from within, significant ones like Tim Keller and Rick Warren, and people outside of the church trying to wake us up to something that we're missing out on. And at the same time, we're getting clues as to how in this world, in this time, in this era, we can communicate this gospel message in a fresh way that the society will hear, will recognize. And at least according to N.T. Wright and Douglas Murray in this, it's not by shrilly being activists on causes that have become amputated and taken on a life of their own apart from their roots in Christianity. It's just fascinating to me to think about, and that's part of the reason why I made this video. Thank you for paying any attention to it at all. Pete out.